Alrighty, so I just recorded a long video talking about the situation in Ukraine with Russia attacking. I talked at length, I talked calmly and peacefully. I gave you my thoughts and my explanations for why I believe what I believe. This video might be too long and too boring for some people who are afraid of education. So I'm going to tell you right now ahead of time that one of the main reasons I believe Russia invaded Ukraine is the same reason that crime has risen across the United States, and I'm talking about homicides and felonious assaults. The reason for this is because weak men are giving evil men the impression that there are no serious consequences for their actions. When Putin was threatening to invade Ukraine and was moving troops in a manner that everybody in the world believed meant they were about to invade Ukraine, and leaders around the world are saying, hey, we're going to sanction you financially, that was giving Putin the same impression that these guys running around on the streets with guns shooting each other get when they're given probation for committing acts of violence. If you want to stop these things from happening, you have to stop putting weak men in power. That's the overall arching thought I have about this entire situation. Although in the video I go a little bit longer and I give you a little bit of history and some stuff like that. So if you'd like the full explanation of my stance on this situation, please watch the video. And let me know in the comments below what you think I got right and what you think I got wrong. Have a look. I'll talk to you later. Alrighty, so today we are going to talk a little bit about this situation in Ukraine. Specifically, the situation with Russia invading Ukraine. Russia taking it upon themselves to invade another sovereign nation. I want to tell you my thoughts about what's going on over there and how it relates to a lot of policy decisions that are being made here in the U.S. And kind of the ramifications of that, and something for people to think about going forward. And I'm talking about who you vote for. Before I get into my personal feelings about the subject and all that, I want to break this down to the most basic way that I can break it down. And the way I'm going to do that is going to be kind of what I told my daughters when they asked me why there's another war going on in the world, why there's a new war, why in 2022 is one country invading another country. I thought we were kind of past that at this point. At least this type of invasion, I can't believe it's happening in 2022. But from my understanding, the best explanation that I can give to why this happened is, everybody knows that after World War II, the Allied forces were pushing one way, and I guess, you had Germany in the middle, and the Allies at the time were Russia and the United States and all the Western nations. The Western nations were pushing to the east. Russia was pushing towards the west, pushed into Germany. They ended up claiming half of Germany, and then every other country that they had to push through, they decided to unite all those countries and make what was known as the Soviet Union, the USSR. There was a lot of fear for the next 50 years or so that the USSR was going to try to expand. And a lot of the things that was happening within the USSR was nations that were previously sovereign nations were now considered Soviet states, and the citizens of those nations didn't necessarily want to be citizens of the USSR, and they were kept in their countries by force. There were walls that were put up, barbed wire put over those walls. People who were gunned down simply trying to travel out of the nation that they lived in. This is what was happening in the USSR. On December 26, 1991, the USSR collapsed. And these nations that used to be part of the Soviet bloc now became sovereign nations once again. I don't have them all listed, but Poland is a big one that comes to mind. Germany was reunited. Ukraine was one of those nations. So that happened in 1991. Now we're in 2022, so we're 30 years plus. And those nations are making decisions for their own future, independent of some of the things that have happened in the past. One of the things that was contemplated was whether or not Ukraine was going to become a member of NATO. NATO is a treaty organization, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, I believe, is what it's called. And that treaty organization that treaty was signed by a bunch of nations specifically to combat the Soviet Union and further expansion of the Soviet Union. The most fundamental, basic explanation of that treaty is that an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us. And it's a defensive treaty in nature, meaning that if the Soviet Union, or now Russia, or any country for that matter, attacks one of the member nations, which is, France, Spain, Great Britain, Turkey, all these other countries, the United States, and many more, if any of those countries are attacked, the rest of the nations in NATO will put the full faith and force of their military into pushing back an attack on that nation. Now, there's been some talk recently about Ukraine requesting to be members of NATO. And there's been a lot of meetings with the NATO countries on whether or not they should allow the Ukraine in. This has made Russia, or Vladimir Putin specifically, nervous. He doesn't want NATO countries to be pushed directly up on his border. He does not like other countries around him that are sovereign making decisions for themselves. There's been a lot of talks back and forth about whether or not Poland is allowed to have short-range defensive missile batteries near the border of Russia. This is something that, in my opinion, we should be past. We should be beyond this in 2022. This is a situation that I explained to my daughter, who's 10 years old. I explained to her as who wants to be their best friend. You might have Becky, Sarah, and Elizabeth. And Sarah is in the middle, and Becky wants Sarah to be her best friend, and Elizabeth wants Sarah to be her best friend. And depending on who she chooses is going to piss off one of the people on the other end. And in this case, Becky decided to attack Sarah because Sarah was threatening to become best friends with Elizabeth, or whoever it is that I chose on this side. This is the kind of an attack that happens by schoolyard type bullies. So Russia decided, you know what, Ukraine, you're not going to become a member of NATO. You're not going to become a member of this defensive treaty organization because we want to reserve the right to attack at any time. That's what Putin is saying when he makes this decision. So he said, you know what, you want to become a part of that treaty organization? We're going to attack it. We're going to attack you because we want control over you. A lot of people are saying that he has this desire to recreate the Soviet Union. I don't think that's an accurate representation of what's going on. He is the equivalent of a nation, of an international domestic violence abuser. He doesn't give a shit about being united with all these people. He just wants to control their actions. And that is what this is about. Now, I don't know where to go next. I wrote down some notes. Let's get into how this attack is going. It's my opinion that Putin believed when he launched his attack that the Ukrainians were going to simply give up. That has led to this going much more slowly than was anticipated by everybody, including the international community, including myself. When this attack was launched, I'm aware of Russia's capabilities. I've been in combat. I've studied combat. I've studied battles. I've studied battle plans. I've studied attack strategies. I know about infrastructure and how these things go. And if you're going to lead and I've been part of a dominating advance into an enemy country. There's certain things that you do to ensure that there's no resistance, to ensure success in battle. I believe that the way the Russians launched this attack, they didn't follow all those steps because they didn't believe that there was going to be any real resistance. This has led to a lot of misinformation and propaganda that's coming out of the battle space. And when it comes to this kind of thing, I want to urge people caution in spreading this information. It's true that the attack is happening much more slowly than we anticipated. But I believe the reason for that is because Putin underestimated his enemy, and he didn't create a battle plan. Him and his generals didn't create a battle plan that was appropriate for the mission. Let's just put it that way. I don't believe it's because the Ukrainians are much stronger than we expected, and I don't believe it's because the Russians are weaker than we thought. I believe it's because they didn't prepare the appropriate battle plan. And then this gets into some of the propaganda that I want to urge caution with people spreading. The first piece of propaganda, not all propaganda I believe is bad. There was this story of 13 soldiers on an island telling the Russians to go fuck themselves. And then the story was that they were all immediately killed, and this was their last defiant stand. There's news coming out now that was not necessarily true, that those guys are still alive. Now, it is true to my knowledge that the Russians said, I can't remember what they said to the people on this small defensive island, and that they did say, you know what, Russia, go fuck yourself. That's a defiant action. I can see that happening. I encourage that kind of activity from any soldier or service member for Ukraine, or any person who lives in Ukraine who is trying to defend his country against an enemy such as Russia. The Russians can go fuck themselves. I feel that with every fiber of my being. I think that's something that we should promote. That story is something that's worth promoting. Whether or not they died at the end isn't so important. It makes it one of those like Russian propaganda hero stories when it comes at, they say that they were all immediately killed. It's kind of that image of somebody with a gun to your head, and you stick in your character regardless of what the threat is. I get that, and I support that kind of thing. Some of the stuff that I don't support is, first of all, there's like the Ghost of Kiev that everyone's talking about. There's different versions of the story going around. One version is that he was a retired colonel, ran to the nearest airstrip, jumped into a MiG, took to the air, and shot down 6 Russian aircraft in a 30-hour span of time. There's other versions that he was a member of just one of their defensive forces and that he single-handedly shot down 6 MiGs during this time. There's a variety of versions of this story that I've watched a lot of stuff. There's a couple guys that are retired fighter pilots that did a video I watched yesterday. C.W. Lemoyne, I think is his name, how you pronounce it. He's Mover on YouTube. He did the most accurate breakdown of all this different propaganda, and his talk was really good. I'll link it in the description. It's an hour long though, and I don't think we need to go into an hour of explaining that. From the first moment that I heard this, I was extremely skeptical because you have to know that Ukraine is a former Soviet bloc nation. There's a lot of Russian history and influence in the country of Ukraine, and the Russians historically and the Soviets are masters of propaganda. So it would only make sense that kind of their cousins or their offspring, or however you want to look at it, former Soviet bloc nations are also going to be masters of propaganda. So they began sharing this story, and it's crazy. There's people making T-shirts for this guy, and he doesn't exist. It's impossible. It's as C.W. Lemoyne said, and I'm probably saying his name wrong. It's not impossible, but it is incredibly unlikely. It's unlikely to the extent that I'm going to say that it's most likely impossible. For one pilot to take out that many aircraft, he would have to land and refuel and rearm his aircraft multiple times during that 30-hour period. He would be incredibly exhausted. The aircraft would most likely not be able to keep flying at that pace and that tempo. He would also have to have an incredible amount of not intelligence like within his own head, but battle space intelligence delivered to him constantly, so he knew where all the aircraft were. He would also have to be the only pilot that was able to swoop in on these guys undetected and take them out. There's videos of these things that have been 100% debunked as flight simulator footage, and I don't know. I'm just going to end it there. Some of the other images that I'm seeing coming out of Ukraine are things that are people are mischaracterizing what's happening in these images. There's images of the president of Ukraine, which his name escapes me right now, and I didn't write any notes down. But there's images of him, with body armor and a helmet and carrying a rifle and stuff like that. People are saying that he's on the front line fighting with his men. No, he's not. I think he's visiting some of his combat leaders, some of his generals and stuff like that, which is awesome. Good for him. He's saying all the right things to encourage his people to continue to fight. He is staying in his country. These are all heroic things, but he has not taken up arms. He's not pointing guns at Russians. He's not putting himself in harm's way to that extent. There's also the is it Vladimir Klitschko? Is that his first name? Klitschko, the mayor of Kiev. Everyone's showing these pictures of him holding some kind of machine gun, some kind of belt-fed weapon, saying that he's out there defending his city and all that. No, he's not. There's not a chance in hell that guy is taking up arms against the enemy. He's doing all the right things to encourage his people to fight. He's being a leader like he should be, but he's not out there fighting Russians. It's not happening. It's not going to happen. Like I've been a soldier in combat, and there's no way in hell that if some civilian leader came to my unit with a gun, there's no way in hell I'm letting him participate in the fight. It's not going to happen. We would spend all of our time trying to protect him from getting hurt, and we would be ineffective. We would be combat ineffective if that were the case. Now, if he wants to put a machine gun on his desk and sit in his office and wait for the Russians to come in, and he wants to unload that that belt on whoever tries to come through that door, more power to you. But he's not out there fighting that fight. There's also images of some beauty queen putting on camo and a helmet and carrying a gun. She's not fighting. I'm sorry, she's not. And a lot of my problem with this kind of propaganda is that it's giving people the impression that all these regular people are out there killing the enemy and that they're going to defeat the Russians and turn the tide, and that the Russians are going to run and hide and all this other stuff. The only thing keeping Ukraine from being completely run over is Putin's decision on how many troops to send into the area. And I want that to be clear. If he wants to completely take over Ukraine, he will. If I were a military leader and I was trying to take over a country and their leaders were being that defiant, I would be launching cruise missiles at every political headquarters in the country. I would be taking out every single electrical power station in that country. I would take out every means of producing energy in that country. I would take out every single communication, every piece of communication in that country. Every single airfield in that country would become impassable. To my knowledge, that has not happened. And Russia is more than capable of making that happen. I don't want people to be believing this propaganda and then wake up a week from now and be like, what? Like, how is Ukraine's military doesn't exist anymore? How does this happen? I thought they were doing so well. It's because you are believing all this false information coming out of the battle space. I think it's important to encourage people to resist and do everything they can to kind of hold off the forces that have been sent into country, with hopes that NATO countries and the United Nations will come up with a plan to support you with more than simply logistics. Because if we as a world community continue to support Ukraine with bullets and fuel and jet fighters, even tanks, but we don't support them by direct action, Ukraine will fall. There's no ifs, ands, buts about it. It's going to happen. Russia has the ability to completely decimate their military force plus every piece of equipment that we send into that country. So the next thing that I want to talk about is the weakness that the world community is showing in light of these events. And that is probably the most frustrating part from my perspective. The reason this attack happened, the reason apartment buildings are now being bombed by Russian missiles and cruise missiles, however they're coming in, the reason Ukrainian soldiers are dying, the reason women and children are dying, the reason millions of people are on foot, damn near freezing to death, trying to get out of that country, the reason people are starving to death, the reason people don't have water, when I think about this situation, what would it be like for my family? I have a 10-year-old and a 6-year-old daughter. I can't even begin to tell you how angry I would be if our political leaders allowed this to happen in our country. And it makes me almost as angry to see it happen somewhere else. Because the reason this is happening is because of weak men. The reason it didn't happen before is because there were stronger men in charge. The reason Russia didn't invade Ukraine in the past is because we had a president that told the Russians, we will fucking bomb you. We will kill you if you try. And the funny thing is, people believed him. I think there's something to I've made these statements in police work as well, that there's something to be had about the person who's standing across from you believing that you are capable and that you are willing to rip them from limb to limb. That if they try to do the wrong thing, it's going to hurt them worse than anything they've ever experienced in their life. I've been in that position as a police officer many times, that sometimes the threat of force and the belief that you will use force is enough to stop somebody's actions and prevent you from having any use of force at all. This is something that for some reason, there are political leaders here in the United States, they don't like that. They don't like officers having that ability, and they don't like officers taking advantage of that type of presence in a situation. One thing that I'm seeing a lot of is this idea that officers have a warrior's mentality, and that we need to stop that. The people who are making those statements have never stood toe to toe with a very dangerous person who has very ill intent. This is where it's very similar what I do and what the president does. I would also go so far as to say, we have the sheepdog analogy, that the sheepdog is the one that's out there protecting the flock. Sheepdogs, from a sheep's perspective, the dog and the wolf look very similar, and the sheep are afraid of both. The sheep want to be protected by a dog that doesn't have any teeth because they're afraid that the dog might turn on them and bite them. The problem is, if you remove all of the sheepdog's teeth, when you're attacked, you can't defend yourself. And that's what we're seeing here in the United States with this tremendous rise in crime and murder happening at unprecedented rates across the country. And now, unfortunately, we're seeing it across the world as well. This lack of a powerful leader, lack of the threat of force, and the belief that there's going to be serious repercussions for your actions is what created an environment where somebody like Putin thought it was okay to invade another sovereign nation and kill tens of thousands of people, including women and children, because that's what's happening right now. That's something that makes me very angry. A couple of things that need to happen from here, and if they don't happen, it's going to end badly for Ukraine, is that the UN needs to declare a no-fly zone over Ukraine. Every piece of Russian equipment that breaks Ukraine's airspace needs to be turned to little bits of dust. As well as United Nations peacekeeping troops need to be on the ground yesterday. This is something that we should not allow to happen as a nation. Actually, as a world community, this is something that should not be happening today. I don't know. I think that's all I have to say about that. So thank you for watching. I'll talk to you soon.